Okay, so this is Professor Grimes from Villanova University. I know him well. We were roommates in Belgium when we were doing graduate studies. Anyways, he's a good guy. And so his lecture, Professor Grimes addresses why the proofs of Anselm and Aquinas may not seem as convincing as they once were, and also demonstrates how their power and significance can be retrieved today. And now you look excited and interested.
All right.
Thanks, Greg.
All right, thanks, Tim. Or Mr. Allen, yeah. Yes, that's right, yeah. Well, I'm grateful for this opportunity, and I'm happy to see all your smiling faces. As Tim said, I come from Villanova University, and I teach mostly first-year students, so they're not that different in terms of age and intellectual sort of place that you are now. So hopefully this will kind of help you get a little taste of what college life will be like in a way. Hopefully you'll also have a little bit of a chance to understand better what you're going to be reading in your upcoming senior seminar. So I was told that you're talking mostly about St. Anselm's proof and St. Thomas Aquinas' proof. And I was excited to hear this because this is a topic that really has interested me for a long time. It's kind of a perplexing thing. And it's funny because often this gets taught in introductions to religion or philosophy or theology, and it seems like, well, this is something we should just learn right off the bat. And it is. You know, there are a lot of good reasons for doing that. You know, if we're going to talk about God, we should try and know something about, well, is there a God? But actually, this is one of the most perplexing, mind-boggling sort of questions that can be tackled. The proofs themselves are confounding. Oftentimes, what people do is they just sort of teach them. You memorize the argument, being than which nothing greater can be thought. Maybe you'll even learn the Latin, and you'll learn each of the 5 ways, maybe be able to sort of recite what they are, and then you kind of leave it at that. And you don't really understand what the significance of these things are. And maybe neither do the professors, because I'll be honest, I've looked into this question a great deal, and I don't know anybody who has really kind of come up with a real sufficient significance of what these proofs actually say. So what I'm going to try and tell to you today is a little odd. I don't know anybody who sees the proofs in the way that I do. Maybe there are, but I just don't know them. They haven't written about it. I haven't written about it yet. So I don't think the proofs are convincing. I think we miss the point when we hear them. We hear this phrase, being than which nothing greater can be thought. And even when we sort of fundamentally understand what that means, we still don't really feel satisfied. Do I get a sense of God now, all of a sudden, from, I say, you know, being than which nothing greater can be thought? I know what that means. It means that if there is sort of the greatest thing possible, sort of, it must be the infinite, it must be God. If there is something better, then it's not God, it can't be God. But it doesn't give me a sense of, wow, I guess I believe in God now. That just doesn't happen. And it's the same thing with the 5 ways. We hear something about, the unmoved mover, that there must be some sort of a mover that isn't moved in order to create the world. And that's supposed to be a proof, and yet you hear that and you say, I understand it, but I don't know if that would convince me to believe in God. So what's the deal? What is the deal? Why are these proofs so popular? Why do we bother with them? It's actually not a very often asked question. It's not a very well understood question. So it's kind of, this is what we're going to deal with. And I'm going to try and do it quickly. So I'll need your really focused attention. But I think actually if you kind of follow along just a couple brief little steps here, you'll actually get what these things are about, and they'll become that much more interesting to you. Okay? So basically what I think the problem is that, first of all, these proofs aren't meant to convince non-believers. We live in a completely different context than that in which these proofs were generated. So Anselm was trying to generate a proof for people who already believed in God. People who lived a life of prayer. So it's in the context of prayer that this argument comes about. So it's not really meant to be convincing to the non-believer. The same thing with Thomas Aquinas. That Thomas, is not trying to convince atheists that God exists. That's not Thomas's intention. And yet that's how we sort of read these proofs. So that's the first mistake. Our expectations of what the proofs are trying to accomplish is a little bit off. We expect this kind of, very solid, almost mathematical proof. Okay, I've got it. I completely have it in my grasp that there is a God and what God is. That's not at all what the intention is, okay? That's the first thing. Even to the point that a lot of theologians today will say, there is no way to prove God's existence. Even though they'll teach these proofs of Thomas Aquinas, they'll say, there is no way to prove nor disprove God's existence. And that is used against the atheists oftentimes, that atheists who sort of generate arguments as to why there is no God or why it's irrational that we believe in God. The theologian can say, well, that's impossible. It is logically impossible to say that there is no God. So, that's sort of used as an example. But it also means then that you can't prove that there is a God also. So, what one hand gives, the other hand takes away. But this is how most theologians think. And so if we look at, there's a statement by the First Vatican Council that actually says that it's a matter of faith that we have to be able to demonstrate God's existence to natural reason. So there are sort of two modes in which we think that God can be revealed. That, most of us here don't believe in God because of a proof. We believe in God because we've been brought up in a tradition, we hear the scriptures, and they've generated some sense of resonance with us. We have an experience of God's presence through these traditions. That's how most of us come to believe. So why do we bother with a proof? Why should we have a proof? There's something about a proof demonstrating God's existence that actually is meant to tell us how we're supposed to think. How we're supposed to think about the world. Okay? So the real goal of the proof is to demonstrate how we're supposed to think about our place in the world and how we're supposed to think about the world itself. Okay? How we're supposed to use reason. Okay? Now, one of the main problems is that we live with sort of a different conception of reason than did Aquinas or Anselm. That we sort of have what I call a retracted sense of reason. And the reason for that is that you can't blame it on this guy, but there's a thinker who had a tremendous amount of influence. Some of you might have heard in your European history classes or something about Kant, Immanuel Kant. He was a thinker in the late 1700s. He died in 1804 and influenced tremendously a lot of modern thinking. And his conception of reason sort of establishes a limit. That we can't know anything about God because our reason just doesn't get us there. So there's this sort of gap between humans' ability to think and God is on the other side of our rational ability. So there's this limit here. And so human reason is meant to be employed toward things of the world. That instead of looking sort of to God with human reason, we're just supposed to look around at the world. Figure out, okay, well, this is here. This is a podium. It's made of wood. Let's know everything we possibly can about this thing. That's why we love science so much. Trying to figure out what's in things. How do things work? And we sort of develop this notion that by understanding things, we can kind of control them. So the world ends up becoming something of our own dominion, that we have control over a lot of things in the world. We can control rivers, we can control medicine, we can control organisms. But when it comes to God, better we just don't think about that, because we can't know anything about God. Because our knowledge is supposed to be based off of human experience. And our only knowledge of human experience can be stuff that we can sort of engage scientifically, empirically. Can we touch it? Can we smell it? Can we look at it under a microscope? We can't do any of those things when it comes to God, so God is not meant to be thought about, really. We can't do it. Thus, we cannot prove God with thought. So this thinker Kant actually rejects all the proofs. He says, the proofs are false. And that's had a lot of weight. Even theologians today, I said, think the proofs don't work. For this reason, a lot of times. And they say that we can only know God through faith, not through reason. But as I said, the Church in the First Vatican Council says, well, no, we have to be able to know God through reason also. So we need to look at the sense of reason that Thomas Aquinas and St. Anselm also had. And what they understood reason to be was always in conjunction, they called ratio, was always in conjunction with the intellect. They called it intellectus. Intellectus. So we have this word intellect. Sometimes a professor at a university is considered to be an intellect, or uses his intellect, or something like that. That we'll see sort of somebody reading poetry, and we'll say, oh, that's very intellectual. That's the sense in which this word gets used now. But in Thomas Aquinas' time, this was a very important idea. The space of the intellect, you could say. So the idea is that human beings have the ability above all other animals. There are no other animals that can be rational. So there's something about human beings that's special. And that kind of tells us something, that we're gifted. We're gifted beings. And so we're supposed to think about stuff. That's sort of our job. We're the only one who has that gift, so I guess that's what we're supposed to do. And when we think hard enough about certain things, sometimes we're able to break into this space of the intellect. And in contrast to this idea where we're sort of trying to determine everything, I'll write that down. Determining what this is, what that is, and sort of getting a grasp or a control over it, that's the role of knowledge here. Actually, the role of knowledge here is to lose your grasp on things. To say, I understand what this is, but because I understand what this is, it's inexhaustibly, abundant in what it is. That if it's almost like when you love somebody. When you love somebody, you don't know every single thing about them, even if you live with them for 100 years. You don't know every single thing about them, and that's what makes them so great. That you could live with them forever, and there would still be something about them that's sort of unspeakable. And that's actually what we try and do when we listen to music or write music. There's something sort of unspeakable about music that just takes us somewhere, and we dwell in this space, and it's impossible to kind of put your finger on just what that thing is. That's the intellect. It's why we do poetry. Poetry tries to express something that's sort of unexpressible. That's the realm of the intellect. Okay? Kant sort of doesn't like this stuff. Modern thinking doesn't like this stuff. We look at poetry and we think, oh, I don't know what that's saying. We look at theology even, and we say, there's no science in that. I don't even know what they're on about. Like, you can't prove anything. You can't do equations. It's just people's opinion. That we want to have things totally determined. And we associate sort of knowledge with things that we can render completely determined. We know exactly what this thing is. We can't do that with God, so blah. What do? Well, here they say, yeah, no, we can't know God. But if we sort of think hard enough about God, then we can enter this space of the intellect and get sort of a sense. I think I'm in the realm of the divine. That I get a sense, in the same sense we do when we listen to music. Sort of say, I can't put my finger on it, but when I'm in this space of the intellect, I can't help but believe that there's a God. I'm sure of it. I can't say what God is or where God is, but I know that God is here somehow. And it sounds sort of pithy and sort of false and woolly, but actually there is a reality. A lot of life's most significant elements are like that. When somebody dies, we don't understand that experience in the same way that we say, okay, this is exactly what happened, and I understand my emotions completely. There's something sort of elusive. And so we enter this elusive space. Well, it's exactly that space where God can show up, and we can get a sense of wonder. That instead of having everything totally determined, that as the goal of thought. So modern thinking tends to say, as scientists, we need to know and understand everything that's in the world. For pre-modern people, it was sort of, we need to achieve a state of wonder. That it's only when we achieve this state of wonder, which goes beyond sort of knowing exactly what everything is. It's a step beyond that and say, you get to know the real significance of it only after you've moved beyond what the chemicals are, what the molecules are, that sort of thing. So it's a higher level of thinking. And it's only not everybody's going to do this. Not everybody's going to be able to understand this. But this is actually what Thomas is trying to do, and this, with these proofs. He's trying to think hard enough about God. The proofs are logical. They follow the rules of logic. So it is very good thinking, but it only works if it delivers you to this place of mystery, this place of astonishment. So actually, we could say that this way of thinking is looking for, this is kind of a little catchphrase, that often when we look at the proofs, we're thinking in this mode. We want a question-stopping answer. When we look at a proof, we want to say, okay, I have no more questions. Case closed. Here, because it is God we're dealing with after all, we're looking for an answer-stopping question. So these are supposed to deliver us to a point where we say, I can't possibly answer this question. It's the most fundamental question. And even that is a sense of achievement. It's like I've sort of come to the brink of the most fundamental thing about all of human existence. So it's the realization that we can't say case closed, like we've figured out everything. It sort of opens up into this mystery. And so Aquinas is actually proving God, in such a way as to say we can't know God. It sounds crazy, but it's saying if we actually get to this space of the intellect and dwell there for a little bit, we'll realize the sense of the mystery, and that mystery will tell us actually that we get a sense of it, but we can't know determinately what it is. It's overdeterminate. It's the greatest thing ever. That's why we say that God is love. It's the most supreme love. And we have to dwell in this space in order to realize that. It's nothing that we can kind of claim for ourselves. One way to think about this is that your reach exceeds your grasp. So if I go like this, I can touch something further than if I try and grab it. And that's what God is like. If we kind of reach out there, we can't get a hold of God and say, okay, I've mastered God, I sort of totally understand God. We just get a touch. And if we try and close our hand and try and master it, then it's gone. And that's how we have to think about these proofs. It's about astonishment, wonder, these are sort of ideas that we don't like thinking about because they take time. All these sort of technological things, they distract us from these sorts of fundamental questions. All these studies have been done about how checking Facebook, checking email all the time, they've reduced our attention spans. Watching television, we can last about 8 minutes before we really start to itch. We're used to dealing with all these sorts of different medium all at once. We're doing IM, we're doing Facebook, we're checking email, and we're doing our homework. And music's playing. In order to sort of achieve this space of the intellect, you really have to do some pretty serious thinking. One of the ways that St. Augustine thinks about this is he actually doesn't try and prove the existence of God at all. That he actually says, well, I can't do it. And he was a pretty good thinker. But what he says is that God is more intimate to me than, I'll abbreviate it sort of, God is more intimate to me than I am to my own self. That if Augustine can sort of get rid of all the distractions in his life for a minute and sort of enter inside of himself and come to terms with his createdness, sort of why he was put here, what's the real nature of who he is as a person, he actually comes to the realization that he's not alone there. He gets this funny feeling. He sort of says, like, there's something else. Even when I feel like I'm totally isolating myself, there's in that space of the intellect, you could say, there's something totally other there. There's something else there. And not only that, but it's something greater. It's something infinite. And so that's how Augustine gets to this sense of God. But that's actually the case here, too. That Aquinas is saying, if we understand the world intimately, if we come to know the world as much as we possibly can, we come to appreciate it in such a sense that it inspires awe. That we realize its elusive qualities. Scientifically, we don't like the elusive qualities. That means we don't understand something. And that means that we're bad scientists. But actually here, we sort of can break through to it and sort of say, well, it's amazing that I've studied this so much and I still don't understand it. It's incredible. So that's the way that we have to kind of rethink these things. The question, to sort of sum up here, in a way, the question that's actually being sort of stated by these proofs is, why is there anything at all? You could sort of sum up each one of these different proofs in a certain way and say, Aquinas is sort of asking the question, why is there anything at all, instead of nothing? That this is a mind-blowing question. And that he thinks that God is pure existence. The thing that's not a thing at all, actually, but what allows there to be anything at all. And it blows his mind. It's the most incredible thought. And even logically, it's the most fundamental question. And this is actually where we have to fight back against the sort of thinking that there is no proof for God. Because if we say to this question, why is there anything at all, that it's just there, then we're closing off the question. And there's something that seems, when it comes to the intellect, when it comes to human thinking, unnatural about that. We don't want that to be the answer. The reason we do science is to try and, understand the world. And to say, well, it's just there, nothing created it, is to say that, well, why bother knowing anything? If knowing anything is just going to end us up with nothing. So actually, when people say, there is no God, there is nothing at all, it's sort of saying, you should say to them, well, why do you do anything at all? Why do you even believe in reason? People say it's irrational to believe in God. Well, it's actually irrational to be reasonable if there is no God. Because logically, the direction of reason is to this realization of God. That's why it acts as a proof. That's why it's a proof. But I think, just to close up here, to come to terms with this question is a fundamental thing. It helps us to kind of break out of the ruts in our life in a way. That oftentimes we'll start to doubt, there is no God, I don't understand the meaning behind any of this, my life is terrible. We feel that way sometimes. Isolated moments where things are just going wrong, we think, what's the point of this? This is ridiculous. How could there be a God and there still be, tragedies and things like that? These are versions, actually, of this fundamental question. Why is there anything at all? Why are there tragedies? It's not that God is doing these things, but it makes us question our existence. Why do we exist at all? And it's at those moments where we're doubting the most, where we're sort of at a loss, that we can push our way into this space of the intellect and maybe regain a sense of God's presence there in the mystery. Like evil. Evil is not a problem that can be solved determinably with sort of logic and math equations and things. Evil is a mystery. And it's when we dwell in the space of mysteries that we can actually get a sense of the most fundamental things in life. And the very most fundamental sort of element of life, you could say, is that which enables it, God. It's the same thing as when we're sort of, struck by the beauty of things. The snow is falling. You might have looked out the window a few days ago and said, this is gorgeous. This is amazing. We live in a world like this. It's being struck like that maybe can open up a space where we think, why is it like this? And we might get a sense of God. That's what these proofs are trying to do. Okay? It may seem totally strange that you read these sort of very methodical proofs from Aquinas and you think, oh, this is boring. But if you think about the fact that Aquinas is actually trying to explain why he's struck by wonder, the sheer wonder of existence, then it seems a little bit more interesting, I think. And it's actually useful. That it actually helps us to live a better life when we can appreciate the fact that our life is a gift and that we're made in the image and likeness of God. And it's through this kind of thinking that we can come to that sort of a realization. Okay?
Thank you very much. We have about 5 minutes for questions.
Yeah.
David.
I understand where you come from, saying that you look at it from a different standpoint and you can kind of understand what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
But for example, like Aquinas, and but how do you take what he says to understand what's more than on the page? Like you're saying.
Yeah, I mean.
State the question so we can't hear what.
If I think I understood your question, you're asking. How does what's actually written on the page by Aquinas get me to this kind of thinking?
How do you get from what's on the page to that?
To that? Yeah, it's because I'm trying to. It's not actually Aquinas anything. It's not anything Aquinas has written in these proofs. It's based on certain things that he writes about his understanding of creation and about how in order to know God we have to realize that we can't know anything about God. These sorts of things, a mystery. But really, it's me trying to reconstruct based on trying to understand Aquinas' life and his way of thinking, how he might have, thought about this. So does that kind of help? You have to kind of understand something about Aquinas and his world, and it's a project because that's a lot of what academics is at a certain point, where you look at what somebody writes and you think, now why would somebody write that? And you kind of have to put the pieces together because they're not all together. So if you understand why, how Aquinas saw the world, how Aquinas understood God, the situation of different believers, it was a very religious time, and he lived in a monastery, and all these different elements sort of help us to understand why he would have thought in this way. Okay?
Kurt, can't you say though that putting why anything at all, can't you just say that putting this label on God, saying God is this, is just another example of the reasoning on the right, rather than just saying oh, it's something we can't understand it at all. It's just another example of humans trying to get a reason
Exactly.
for why the world works.
See, that's why Aquinas is so brilliant, because he says that it's almost how he knows he's right about this. It's because it empties him. It empties his ability to think. So as soon as he tries to put a label God on this thing, he realizes that it vanishes. He actually says we need these proofs in order to not make God into an idol. Because when we actually do follow this way of thinking and we get to that space of the intellect, we know what we're talking about, we put a label on it, but we always know that it's insufficient. And that's why you could think of poetry, that human language gets us to a certain point often, and then it's remarkable at how it can get us to a certain point, and then we say, but that doesn't do justice. And you're sort of frustrated. But it's dwelling in that frustration and realizing that all of our language is insufficient that you're able to sort of deal with this. And so Aquinas talks a lot about what we call negative theology, where we can say only what God is not. That we can say God is a rock. Well, that sounds idolatrous. That's ridiculous. We don't worship rocks, that sort of thing. But precisely in saying God is a rock, we understand that God is also not a rock. But we can understand something about God in doing that, in a way, that God is stable and eternal, that kind of thing. But even those words, Aquinas is fully aware they don't do justice. But at the same time, there's something about that mystery that he comes into contact with that he has to try and explain it in some way. You want to be in communion with this thing, and it's like when you're in love with somebody. You can't put words on it, but you try to anyway. That's what it's like. Does that help? Okay.
Nick, you had a question? Did you have a question, Nick?
No? Okay.
After all that studying, do you believe in God now?
That's a good question. That's not the first time I've got that question. When I was studying...
Just restate it.
Yeah. After all this studying, do I still believe in God? And actually that's not the first time I've got that question. Usually it wasn't asked in such a nice way. That you asked it in a very nice way. But people are actually accusing me of not believing in God. Because I study it so much, this sort of topic in theology. But it's one of those things. You come to, you study something so much that you develop sort of a love for it. That's what philosophy is, the love of knowledge. And it's love again. Love of philosophy is this realm of the intellect where you study something precisely to enter into that spot where you're just like, I can't go any further, but this is awesome. It sounds crazy that theology could be like that, but there are times when I'm sitting in my office and I'm writing something and I just think, I get chills. I'm like, there's no way I can do justice to this, but I'm going to try anyway. You just thrust with this mystery, and it happens also in the real world. You see something happen, like somebody helping their grandmother or something like that, and you're just like, a lot of this study sort of enters into your mind, and you could analyze that, but in the end, it's going to be this mystery where you're just like, wow, why do we do that? Why are human beings like that? So yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of times intellectuals have become frustrated, who have been believers. Like there's a French thinker, Merleau-Ponty. He sort of did so much philosophical study that in the end he said, yeah, actually I don't think I can admit that I believe in God. But luckily it hasn't happened to me, and I don't think it has to happen. Yeah.
Graham?
So you keep going back to this not being able to do justice and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And we're kind of going through like the faith and reason, but do you think faith and action does do it justice?
Well, I mean, even the fact that you're using the word justice, I think is interesting. Yeah, but in a sense, the proofs also the proofs don't just teach us how to think; they teach us how to be in the world altogether. And so, if they teach us that there is a God of love, then we also realize that the only reason we can have a sense of God's love is by and sort of love. The only way that we can love God is by loving our neighbor. So yeah, that's one of the important things, that you can't just think about these things. There's something fundamental. When you do realize that there is a God and you're touched by that experience, then it actually causes you to want to go out and make the world a more just place. Jesus' message of the Gospels was precisely because he had this very close relationship, in a way you could say, not through philosophical thinking necessarily, but through reflecting on the events of his life, that Jesus comes to an intimate sense that's completely unique of God's vision for the world, and Jesus proclaims that as the kingdom of God, and doesn't just proclaim it in an intellectual way, but sticks his fingers in the ear of the deaf person, and spits in the eyes of a blind person. It was very physical actions of justice and that sort of thing. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else?
These are great questions, by the way.
All right, say thank you one more time.
Thank you.